Good morning. I want to welcome all of you today for a presentation by former Assistant Secretary of the Interior Ann Castle on universal access to clean water for tribal communities. My name is Buzz Thompson, and I will be moderating the discussion this morning. Ann Castle will begin with a presentation, but we will make sure that there is adequate time for questions at the very end. One of the things, therefore, I encourage all of you to do is if you have questions that you would like Ann Castle to answer, at any point during the presentation or after the presentation, you can go to the Q&A function at the very bottom of the webinar page and insert your question there. And we will later in the presentation get to as many of those questions as we can. I would like to begin by recognizing that Stanford University sits on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, and consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. With that in mind, I'm very pleased that our first talk of the academic year focuses on an initiative to advance universal access to clean and safe water for Native American nations. This will be the first of a variety of talks that we will be sponsoring this year, both on Native American water issues as well as various other water questions. And we are extremely privileged this morning to have as our speaker Ann Castle. Ann is a nationally recognized water expert who's worked in this field for decades. She is a senior fellow at the Getches Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment at the University of Colorado Law School. She's also the founding member of the Water Policy Group, which brings together a select group of water experts to provide advice to governments and international bodies handling complex water policy and strategy. As I noted at the very beginning of this talk, she also, from 2009 to 2014, was the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science at the U.S. Department of the Interior. And in that capacity, she both oversaw water policy and science policy for the Department of the Interior, and had responsibility for managing both the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Geological Survey. And is, after she finished at the Department of the Interior, we were very pleased to have her here at Stanford as actually our very first Landreth visiting fellow. Today, she continues her work in the water field, as I said, at the Getches Wilkinson Center, and she is very active in the nonprofit area. She is either the chair or a member of the board of the Colorado Water Trust, the Western Resources Advocates, Colorado Legal Services, the Salazar Center for North American Conservation, the Airborne Snow Observatory, as you can tell, and is both somebody who's very active in water and a dedicated servant of the public interest. And I should mention she's also a graduate of the University of Colorado Law School, which I consider to be one of the best law schools in the nation. So with that, and absolutely convinced I'm forgetting something, I'm going to hand things over to Ann for her presentation. And then at the end of her presentation, I'll probably ask Ann one or two questions of my own. and then we will turn to your questions. So Anne, thank you again for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you, Buzz. I appreciate the very kind introduction. And probably you can tell that I've signed myself up for too many boards. But today, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about universal access to clean water for tribes. You know, access to clean water is such a fundamental basic service, and most Americans take it for granted. And it comes as a surprise to most Americans that some of our neighbors on Native American reservations don't have that basic commodity. So that's something that we need to be more aware of, and we also need to fix it. And I'm going to talk about both of those things today. So this project on universal clean water for tribes arose through a group called the Colorado River Water and Tribes Initiative. And that's a group that is inclusive of all 30 tribes in the Colorado River Basin. And the mission of that group is to elevate tribal voices in discussions around Colorado River operations and management. And it's no secret that the operating guidelines that govern the Colorado River operation right now were negotiated pretty much in the absence of tribal interests and tribal voices. And the Colorado River Water and Tribes Initiative is intended to solve that problem. So this initiative on universal access was spawned through that larger effort. It's been getting a fair amount of attention that the incidence of COVID on Indian reservations is much higher than in the general population. And the CDC keeps statistics on COVID incidence, death, hospitalization rates by ethnicity. And those statistics tell us that Native Americans have the highest death and highest hospitalization rate of any ethnic group. I think deaths are 2.5 times that in the white population. Hospitalization rates are 3.5 times in the white population. And I just read an amazing statistic yesterday that is the second bullet point. The Washington Post has kind of parsed through the CDC statistics and looked at those rates by age group. And in the younger cohort, 18 to 39 years old, the death rate among Native Americans from COVID is 9 times that in the white population. Just astounding figures. And the incidence of COVID in Indian reservations has been correlated to a lack of indoor plumbing. There's some academic scholarly work on this. And the lack of access to clean drinking water is correlated with COVID incidents in general, but in particular on Indian reservations. That is a problem. So with respect to access to clean drinking water, Native American households are 19 times more likely than white households to lack indoor plumbing. That is a general category, indoor plumbing, that could include lack of sanitation, no indoor toilets, but it also includes lack of access to water. The statistics are broad, and also it's not easy to get data on this kind of commodity on Native American reservations. So some of them are generalized, and I'm going to refer to a couple of those. For example, 48% of tribal homes don't have access to either clean drinking water or basic sanitation. Again, that's an aggregated figure. But for example, on the Navajo reservation, it's estimated that about 1/3 of the homes don't have piped water coming into the home. So it's some subset of that 48% number. And interestingly and tragically, race is the strongest predictor of water access. It's not rural location, it's race. So that gives us something to think about. So this initiative on universal clean water access is multi-pronged. First of all, we wanted to better understand the problem. And like I said, the statistics are aggregated in general and hard to obtain. So we wanted to get a better handle on exactly what lack of access exists. We wanted to educate people about this issue because, like I said, most Americans have no idea that their neighbors on reservations don't have the same kind of drinking water access that they do. We wanted to get support for solving the problem. We didn't want to just document what the issue was, but promote real solutions on the ground. And finally, we wanted to seize this moment in time because we have a window of opportunity right now based on a convergence of a number of different factors that will allow us to make progress. So we want to make sure we don't miss this opportunity. One of those factors that makes this the right place, right time, is the Biden administration's priorities. These are the four primary priorities of the Biden-Harris administration: COVID relief, economic recovery, racial equity, and climate change. And if you had a Venn diagram with these priorities in the circles, that overlap right in the middle would include universal access to clean water in Indian country. It's the sweet spot here. And that's one of the reasons we have this moment in time. So the initial part of our project focused on research. We did a survey of all 30 tribes in the Colorado River Basin, asking about their specific data on lack of access to clean drinking water. So we have some better information on what that looks like for those 30 tribes. And this report that I'm sure will be in the chat, you can link directly to it. It also looked at the law on the federal trust responsibility to Indian tribes as applicable to providing access to clean water as a component of the promises that have been made to tribes that they would have a permanent and livable homeland on their reservations. And finally, the research report reviewed the various different federal agency programs that are aimed at solving some component of this problem. What we found in the survey and looking at the situations on the ground within the Colorado River Basin tribes was that lack of access to water can take several different forms. We think primarily of the situation where there's no pipes to the house, but it can also include inadequate quality of water that's not drinkable, not safe to drink, aging infrastructure, and operation and maintenance issues. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about all four of those. So first, lack of piped water. This is a picture of a typical Navajo hogan, and there's no piped water coming in. So you can see the buckets by the side of the house. Those are going to be filled up either by a truck that comes through periodically, that is a water tanker truck that you can use then to fill those buckets, or perhaps the members of this household take their pickup truck with their empty buckets to a watering station and fill them that way. And then this will be the supply that's available for everything. Drinking water, sanitation water, livestock. So yeah, that's a lot of different uses come out of those buckets. And sometimes if they are going to watering stations to fill up their containers, those watering stations could be 50 miles away. It could be 1.5 hours round trip, or 1.5 hours one way to get to the water filling station. So very significant issues. Water quality is also pervasive in Indian country. This is a sign on the Hopi Reservation where the water system was constructed in the 60s, but has been contaminated by naturally occurring arsenic and contamination as a result of coal mining in the area. So the water is not drinkable. The residents in many of the areas in the Hopi Reservation are also forced to drink bottled water or haul water from a central watering point. Aging infrastructure is also an issue. This is a photo from the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon, where again, the system was constructed in the 60s and 70s, and it's fallen apart. And that creates reliability issues. The water gets shut off when there's a break in the pipe like this one. And it can create contamination issues, so the water quality is no longer sufficient. And finally, operation and maintenance. This is a picture from Arizona. These systems in Indian country can go to very remote locations. There may be long stretches of pipelines, and the Native American communities are frequently unable to support the operation and maintenance that is required to keep these systems in good working order. That's partially a tribal capacity issue. They don't have necessarily skilled operators on site within the tribal community. And they may not have the economic support from their customer base to be able to provide for the level of operation and maintenance that is necessary. So here's what we think needs to occur in order to solve this problem: a commitment from the government, funding, and a whole of government approach. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of those things. But first, I think I'll just call your attention to the photo on the right. That's a water tank on the Navajo Reservation. And there have been a couple of different efforts over time to engage street artists and muralists to do this kind of art on the reservation. And I just think this one is so fantastic. And really, it demonstrates the beauty of the reservation, but it also calls our attention to the water situation. So a commitment. Ideally, we think we should have a White House statement that universal access to clean and safe drinking water will be provided to all Native American communities. That would include a directive to the various federal agencies that have jurisdiction over Native American water systems. It would establish deadlines, metrics, have a dashboard so you could see what progress was being made. And that may sound ambitious, but other countries have done this. India, for example, committed in 2019 that it would provide a tap water hookup to every household in India. They have 160 million households to get hooked up. And since 2019, they've hooked up 50 million of them. Unbelievable. But it's because the government committed to solving that problem. Canada has made a commitment to its First Nations. The problem in Canada is more of a water quality issue. They have a lot of drinking water advisories on the First Nation lands, and they have made a commitment to eliminate drinking water advisories for First Nations. They set a deadline of 2021. They didn't make it. And now the government of Canada is being sued by a coalition of First Nations, which doesn't sound like an ideal result, and it's not. But when a commitment is made, then people can be held accountable and responsible. And that's what we think is needed in Indian country here. Funding, a huge issue. These are 4 of the agencies. This is not an inclusive or all-inclusive list, but these 4 agencies have programs that can deal with a portion of the problem in providing clean water access. And I'll come back to exactly what kind of funding is needed for those programs. And then finally, a whole of government approach. As I said, there are multiple agencies, multiple programs that deal with clean water access for tribes. And they each have different funding streams. They each have different authorities. They have different application processes for their grants. And they don't necessarily talk to each other. And so this is just a primary example of the need for a whole of government approach and interagency task force where tribes can come and say, here's the problem. And it's the responsibility then of the agencies to figure out which agency has the best program, the best fit, and work with each other to bring all of those resources and all of the expertise within the agencies to bear. So that kind of an interagency group would assess the need, and the needs are nationwide, they're pervasive, and they are unique. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. So this would be an intensive process of assessing the need and identifying the causes of failure in the past, because there have been failures, and some of it is attributable to barriers in the agency programs that could be removed. Obviously, consultation with tribes is critical, and then together with the tribes, the necessary systems, maybe it's a treatment system, maybe it's a new piped water system, have to be planned, designed, and built. There is a lot of support for this concept of universal access, and very supportive resolutions have been introduced in both the House and the Senate that are that state the issue and state the support. So these resolutions say access to reliable, clean drinking water in tribal communities is an essential human need. They also recognize that providing this service is an essential component of the federal trust responsibility. Now, these are pending. They have not been adopted. The House resolution, by the way, was introduced by Joe Neguse, representative from Colorado, co-sponsored by Jared Huffman and Grace Napolitano from California. The Senate resolution was introduced by Michael Bennett of Colorado and has 10 of his colleagues in the Senate as co-sponsors. One issue I just want to call your attention to is that providing clean drinking water shouldn't be conditioned on a settlement of tribal reserved water rights claims. Getting those claims settled is critical, and that needs to happen. But those settlement discussions are very long lasting. Some in Arizona, for example, have been going on for 40 years. They're very complicated, and they sweep in a whole bunch of other issues that are not related to drinking water access. And so we want to be very clear that just because a tribe doesn't have settled reserved rights, that should not block their access to clean drinking water. So funding. Two bills specifically address this lack of funding. First is Senate Bill 2369 that is co-sponsored by Bennett, Heinrich, Warren, and Hickenlooper. And I'll go through some of the specifics of that. It's called the Tribal Access to Clean Water Act of 2021, and it tries to appropriate funding for the unmet need in those different agencies that were listed before. Senate Bill 1895, sponsored by Lujan, Heinrich, Sinema, and Rounds, is focused on the same thing. It focuses solely on the Indian Health Service. And both of those pieces of legislation were drafted, introduced in June and July, but drafted to fold into an infrastructure bill. So in Senate Bill 2369, there's funding for the Indian Health Service, most importantly for this sanitation facilities deficiency list. That's where the Indian Health Service identifies all of the households that they're aware of that don't have access to clean water and the projects that would provide that access, and then estimates what the cost is. And they do that in a report to Congress. So it's an objective measure of what the funding need is. It may be a little low because of the way that Indian Health Service calculates that need, but it's still a big number, and it's a good starting point. So the current estimate of the Indian Health Service is that the deficiency would require $3.1 billion to correct. The $3.4 billion comes from an add-on for additional administrative costs that would be required to deploy that amount of money. Then there's funding for technical assistance and training, and $500 million in funding for operation and maintenance assistance. And I want to call that out because the Indian Health Service has had authority, legal authority, since the 1970s to provide assistance to tribes for the operation and maintenance of their water and sanitation systems. But that authority has never been funded. And so there isn't any funding assistance available to tribes for O&M. And this Senate bill would correct that problem. Then there's funding for the Bureau of Reclamation, both for technical assistance and for rural water supply projects, EPA, state revolving funds. There's one state revolving fund for the Clean Water Act. There's one for the Safe Drinking Water Act. Both of those funds have tribal set-asides. That's what TSA stands for. And that's very useful money for correcting water quality problems. And so the Senate bill would fund that. in addition to whatever goes into the state revolving funds. And then finally, USDA has grants for water and sanitation systems in rural and tribal communities, and it would plus that up. So this is just an example of appropriations versus need. And as I said, the Indian Health Service estimates the need to solve the sanitation problems. And when they use the word sanitation, they're talking about both sewer systems and water systems. So it's a broad term. But their estimated need is in the reddish orange bars, and their appropriations in the yellow orange bars. So you can see what the disparity is. And we're trying to correct that problem. So there's been great support for Senate Bill 2369, the National Congress of American Indians. There's a letter signed by 20 tribal leaders in the Colorado River Basin, the 10 Tribes Partnership, which is also a Colorado River Basin group, has supported the legislation. Coalition of water organizations like National Water Resource Association and U.S. Water Alliance, they've supported the funding legislation. There's a coalition of businesses like Intel and various other large corporations that have supported this. So it's got really good support. And as a result of that, a portion of the funding that Senate Bill 2369 would provide is in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that has been passed by the Senate. This is the bipartisan bill, the $1.5 trillion bill that got 10 Republican senators' votes. In that bill is $3.5 billion for the Indian Health Service sanitation deficiency list. We had asked for 3.4. We got a bonus of $100 million. That's great. There's plus ups for the EPA state revolving funds. And because the tribal set-asides are percentages of those state revolving funds, they got way plussed up as well, even more than what was proposed in Senate Bill 2369. And finally, there's significant funding for Reclamation's rural water program. But it didn't give us everything. So we're hopeful that some of the remaining items in Senate Bill 2369 can be folded into the budget reconciliation package. That's the $3.5 trillion bill. And of course, all of this is up in the air, but this is the hope and the plan, particularly for that IHS Operation and Maintenance Assistance Authority and the various other things that were in the Senate bill that haven't yet gotten funding. One other sort of side note deals with how this issue plays in the ongoing discussions around Colorado River operating guidelines. The current operating guidelines that govern Colorado River management will expire at the end of 2025. And there are discussions underway about what the next version of those guidelines is going to look like. Tribes were not included when the current guidelines were put in place in 2007, but all of the state principals and the federal agencies have committed to having tribes at the table this time. Not clear how that's going to take place or what it's going to look like, but there is a commitment to making it happen. A possibility, and this is totally up to the tribes and tribal leaders, is that they could take the position, the tribal leadership in the Colorado River Basin, that universal access to clean water for Colorado River tribes would be part of the deal in the renegotiated guidelines for operations. Don't know, that decision has not been made, but that is something that comes up in questions and certainly is a possibility. And what we're doing now, we're trying to work on this funding legislation, both trying to ensure that the funding that's in the bipartisan bill stays there, and that those remaining items get placed in the $3.5 trillion bill, or whatever the number ends up being, if there is a bill. Our group is also working on a report on administrative reform recommendations. I kind of alluded to the fact that there are barriers in these federal programs that provide funding, but barriers to accessing that funding. And there are ways to fix that. Some of the barriers are there because the agencies had very limited funding and understandably circumscribed what they would fund and prioritized it. In a more complete funding environment, if the funding in these infrastructure bills comes through, those circles, that, those limitations are no longer appropriate or needed. And so we're trying to make some recommendations about that and about how to streamline the interagency process. We're trying to work with some of these federal agencies on implementation of a universal access initiative that is dependent on funding. So we've got sort of a chicken and egg thing going on. And we would like to, and we've worked with congressional staff to promote the idea of future congressional hearings on this issue, where, that's part of the educational purpose. Oops. So I'll just close with our website here. There's a lot of information there. The address is tribalcleanwater.org. And I'll just say that, I'll reiterate that I think the country is in the right place now to solve this problem. We've got the potential availability of significant infrastructure funding. And I think we also have much more widespread recognition of structural racial inequities. And this effort, solving this lack of access to clean and safe drinking water for tribal communities, it's really part of the unfinished business of our republic. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Buzz.
Thank you very much, and for really an excellent presentation on what is a urgent and critical issue. I have some questions I'm actually going to save until the very end about the Water and Tribes Initiative more generally, because I really just want to stay focused on the clean drinking water issue that you've been focused on, because it is just so critically important. And we already have a number of really good questions that have been asked. I just want to remind everyone, if you go down to the Q&A function at the bottom of your page, just type in your question there, and we'll try to get through as many of these as we can. So the very first question, I'm going to paraphrase, is why did it take so long for us to get to this particular point? The first person to put up a question may very well be from Alaska, because the presenter notes that in Alaska, they've been dealing with the problem of infrastructure and water supply for decades now. So you were Secretary or Assistant Secretary of Interior during the Biden administration. Why did it take us this long to actually recognize there's a problem here and do something about
You know, it's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a complete answer to it. I will say, referring to Alaska, that Alaska Native communities have probably the greatest number of households in the country that do lack access to clean water and some of the most challenging construction issues, as you might expect. Remoteness is an issue, construction season is an issue, and it's not just the native villages, but all rural residents in Alaska. And so I think possibly the commonality of the significant rural Alaska villages with the native village lack of access to clean water has meant that there is attention focused on solving the problem, but there's still a long way to go. I do think that the issue of settling tribal reserved water rights claims has occupied the attention of the Western states and the Department of the Interior for a long time. And I think there was an unspoken assumption, if not an overt one, that, well, if you haven't settled your water rights claims, then we can't get you piped drinking water. That doesn't follow, but I think that's at least part of the reason for slowness of recognition that this is an issue. And frankly, I think that the press attention that was being paid to the disproportionate incidence of COVID on reservations, and that started about a year and a half ago, when COVID was peaking, that has really focused attention on the issue. And then you combine that with water quality issues in Flint, Michigan, it's like, oh my God, these people don't have access to clean drinking water. I think all of those things are converging to allow greater recognition of the problem, greater focus on solving the problem.
it? Okay, thanks. A number of the questions also deal with issues of tribal sovereignty. And I think the question that I would have is, what will be the tribe's role in actually solving this particular problem? Is this a situation where the Bureau of Reclamation or the federal government's going to come in and say, this is what needs to be done and we're going to do it? Or is this one where the tribes themselves will be actively involved in figuring out for each reservation what needs to be done, and maybe even doing a lot of the work themselves so that they build up a capacity to actually plan and manage the systems themselves? I know many tribes have already done that, but to what degree will the tribes be involved? Will this be an opportunity to actually let the tribes assert their own sovereignty?
Yeah, well, I think that the tribes have to be the leaders. And as I said, each of these situations is unique, and tribal capacity varies from tribe to tribe. There are 574 federally recognized tribes, and at least half of them have some form of lack of access to clean water, one of the 4 different forms that I mentioned. But the tribes have to determine what the need is and how they want to solve it. The federal agencies can make expertise and funding available, and some of that funding can help create and enhance tribal capacity. For example, one of the problems that we hear a lot about is, well, there's all these grant programs out there. As a tribal member or even the head of a tribal water department, I don't know what they all are. They all have different application requirements. Some of them have very significant financial requirements in order to apply. And we just don't have the capacity, the resources to figure out which is the right program and how to access it and get an application filed and hire an engineering firm. So all of that has to be developed. And I will say that in our discussions with the California State Water Resources Control Board and Cal EPA, that there's really great stuff going on in California, partly as a result of the fact that big state funding is available to help with water systems in tribal communities. The idea is to set up a one-stop shop where the tribes can come to the state agencies and say, here's the problem. And then the state agencies make it their business to figure out what programs fit and how the various different agencies are going to work together with the tribe to solve that problem. That's what needs to happen in the federal community as well. And just one other point, there are some areas of reservations that do not wish to have piped water to households or pipes crossing certain lands because it would disturb sacred lands or cultural resources. And that has to be respected as well. So what you said at the beginning of your question, Buzz, about are the federal agencies just going to take this on and do it? No, that's not the way it should happen.
Great. So you mentioned in answer to that question, federally recognized tribes. There have been several questions about those tribal nations that have not been federally recognized and to what degree they might also be able to take advantage of this initiative.
Yeah, and that is such a good question. A lot of the authorities that these federal agencies have to help solve this problem are authorities to assist federally recognized tribes. And so the funding has to kind of go through that funnel. Having said that, there are programs that are available to assist in water and sanitation systems for rural communities, undeveloped or underdeveloped communities, vulnerable communities, underserved communities. You know, there's a whole bunch of different adjectives that have some funding available. And I haven't looked into this in detail, but it's sort of been the assumption in the back of my mind that those programs would be available for unrecognized tribes.
Along those lines, Alf Brandt actually asked an excellent question. And that is, how do you see this initiative to ensure that Native American nations have adequate access to safe and secure water? How do you see the interaction of that and the human right to water? So as you probably know, California, I think, is still the only state that actually recognizes the human right to water and is working actively on that particular issue. So is this initiative something that can be used, for example, to heighten discussion more generally of the human right to water? Or would that potentially dilute this initiative? So how do you see those two very closely related questions interplaying?
Yeah, and you know, that also sort of brings in the sustainable development goals of the United Nations that includes a commitment to get access to clean drinking water and basic sanitation to all people. This effort on universal access for tribal communities is clearly a subset of that broader goal. And it's absolutely the case that rural communities in general have issues with lack of access to clean drinking water. But there are a couple of unique things about the tribal communities. Number one, as I said, race is the strongest predictor of lack of access to clean water, with Native American households at the top of the list. And number two, there is the trust responsibility, a federal trust responsibility to Indian tribes, and a treaty responsibility to provide a permanent livable homeland. You don't have a livable homeland if there's not clean drinking water available. So those are unique characteristics. And while certainly recognizing and promoting universal access for all households in the United States, we do have some concern that funding streams would be diluted. And if history is our guide, Native American communities could very well come out at the bottom of the list if the program is focused on all rural communities, not just tribal.
Thanks. You also, in answer to an earlier question, talked about what the state of California is doing right now. And several questions want to know, what is the role of states here? And obviously the federal government has a unique trust responsibility, but what's the role of states? And in addition to California, other states stepping up here to help?
Well, I would say that among the different state representatives that we've talked to, California has had the most advanced discussion around this issue. Partly because there's so many tribes in California, a lot of small tribes, where there's mixed tribal and non-tribal members of communities. The federal funding streams get really complicated in communities that are not primarily tribal. And California has a bunch of water funding available as a result of recent appropriations and bond issues. And so again, when funding is available, that makes a huge difference in what states are able to do. I think states need to be helpful and not a barrier in terms of administration of water rights, getting the water into the pipes that go to the houses. There may be state funding available. As I said, I think that is most prominent in California, and I haven't seen that happening as much in other states. But I don't want to undermine the emphasis on the federal trust responsibility to make this happen. It can't happen without the states being involved in the cooperation of the states, but I think because we're talking about tribes, it's primarily a federal responsibility.
We have a number of members of the audience who come from the science or technology side. And so one question that I see repeated several times is for those working on the technology, is there any R&D here that would be useful? And what steps are being taken to make sure that as we solve this problem, we solve it in a way which takes into account climate change and will be resilient going forward.
Right. Well, I think as to the latter part of the question, that is just crucial, because we're seeing, particularly in rural communities in general, the bottom's fallen out of the water table, and so the municipal wells can't access water anymore, or the surface supplies are drying up, and so the whole water system is not as reliable. I think that climate resilient design of these systems is critical. I'm not an expert in water technology by any means, but I think that there are R&D issues that will need to be technology will need to be enhanced in order to deal with some of these situations. Alaska, again, is a great example because some of the problems there, and that also intersects with climate change, because some of the problems in the Alaska water systems are due to the fact that water pipelines used to be buried in permafrost. That's not permafrost anymore. And so the systems, the pipes are buckling, and yeah, so that kind of design will be critical, but also because a lot of these systems go in remote areas, there seem to be problems with chlorine residuals and stagnation of supplies, and just what is the best technology and source of supply to serve some of these very remote and rural communities. One of the things that we struggle with is it may be that a piped water system is not practical, feasible, doable for some of the most remote locations. And I hesitate to say that because feasible can sometimes just mean, well, it's more expensive than it would be in Sacramento. And of course it is. And we don't want to be making judgments about how much is the right cost per person or per household. But it may be that disaggregated water systems and technology developed around that would be a better solution for some of the very remote communities that might otherwise have to wait years and decades to get a more centralized piped water supply.
I want to ask one final question because we only have about 3 minutes left. And I told you I wanted to come back and talk just a little bit more about the initiative that this is part of. So could you just briefly tell us a little bit more about what the Water and Tribes Initiative is? And here's one more thing to squeeze into that 3 minutes. What, if anything, it's taught you about how we might more effectively have collaboration between Native American nations and the United States?
Well, the Water and Tribes Initiative has been around for only about 4 years, and it was formed originally as a result of the recognition that the tribes in the Colorado River Basin had not been involved in the discussions around the current set of operating guidelines that went into place in 2007, not involved in the US agreements with Mexico on the Colorado River, and only limited involvement in the recent set of agreements called the Drought Contingency Plan that was reached in 2019. And the there's also been, also released in 2019 was a tribal water study in the Colorado River Basin that quantified the amount of tribal rights at about 20 to 25% of the total amount of water in the system belonging to tribes. And so that provided objective recognition of the absolutely critical nature of tribal water rights in the system and the need to involve tribes. And so the Water and Tribes Initiative is intended to be a forum to focus the tribal interests and tribal voices, so that they can be players in the discussions around the guidelines. And that continues. Part of that initiative now is what they're calling a tribal leaders forum that consists of the top officials in each of those 30 tribes, with the idea being that if they are able to coalesce around particular asks in the operating guidelines negotiations, that will provide a better platform in order to get those interests recognized and incorporated into the next set of guidelines. So,
Okay.
yeah, and you know,
go
in
ahead.
relationship with the U.S., I think that having a focal point like the Water and Tribes Initiative makes it easier for federal officials to respond. When they've got 30 different voices or 574 different voices, all saying different stuff, it is very, very difficult for the federal agencies or high-level officials to know what to do. And so providing a forum to concentrate and focus those interests is a really useful phenomenon, not just for the tribes, but also for the governmental agencies that they're dealing with.
Okay, thank you, Anne. And thank you for, again, a wonderful presentation today on a critical subject. Obviously, an hour is not anywhere close to the amount of time that we should allot to a discussion of this issue. And we will be doing more talks later in the year on this subject. So I want to thank you, Anne. I also want to thank Felicia Marcus for actually suggesting and getting this organized. We will make sure that Anne actually sees all the questions. And Anne, if you feel like you want to, you can respond to them individually. But thank you all for your participation. And I want you all to have a great day.